Matti is a Canadian-born journalist and author who moved to Israel in 1995, and many of you have read his pieces in the New York Times. He's reported from Israel, Lebanon, Morocco, and Moscow, among many other places, as well as Washington, D.C. And his writing has appeared in publications such as the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and the Washington Post. In 2016, he wrote Pumpkin Flowers, which was chosen as a New York Times notable book and as one of Amazon's 10 best books of the year. And it was also selected as one of the year's best by Booklist, Mother Jones, Foreign Affairs, and the National Post. His first book, The Aleppo Codex, won the 2014 Sammy Rohr Prize and the American Library Association's Sophie Brody Medal. His latest book, Spies of No Country, was published last year, and it tells the tale of Israel's secret agents who went undercover in Beirut for, I think, 2 years at the birth of the Mossad. So this session is going to unpack the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which contains a few important assumptions. One is that the conflict is between two actors, Israelis and Palestinians, and two is that it could be resolved by those two actors. So Matti's kind of just going to discuss the narrative around that, describing in his view how the media has shaped Western views of the conflict. And with that, I'll kick it over to Michael.
So Matti, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us. It's always so wonderful to see you and connect with you. How are things in Israel? I know it's a little bit further along than we are in the US in terms of reopening around COVID. So can you just give us a little glimpse into what your daily life is like right now?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. And I wish we could be doing this in person, but we'll have to make do with this very strange setup. I don't know how much to tell you guys about what's going on here because I don't want to make anyone feel bad, but I also want to be accurate. In Israel, things have moved a lot further toward reopening than the States. Schools are open, restaurants are open. Some public transportation is still shut, but most is open. And in general terms, the country's basically functioning. People are generally wearing masks in the street, but if you go out in my neighborhood, for example, you'll see that people are sitting in cafes and restaurants. People try to sit outside, but you can also sit inside. At the same time, there's been a spike, still a small one, so we're not sure exactly where it's going. There's been a spike in new cases ever since things reopened. So people don't know if there's going to be another wave of this or not. But in general, the general feeling in the country is that the worst is behind us, and normal life is resuming more or less, with the exception, of course, of international travel. The airport is still, not really functioning, and Israel is a very small and quite isolated country. So when we can't go anywhere, it really means we can't go anywhere. Israelis are used to flying all over the place and traveling a lot, and that's a big change for people. But inside the country, things are okay.
Anytime that we're talking about the Middle East, I think it's always helpful to start with a little bit of history about, really how that history has shaped events in Israel and throughout the Middle East. Last fall, some of our participants today may be familiar with an op-ed you wrote in the New York Times, where you used the film Born in Jerusalem to talk about how Israeli attitudes towards peace and security have changed over the last 20 years. Can you talk a little bit more about this history and give us a little bit more insight into how it's influenced Israeli politics today?
Sure. This should only take 9 or 10 hours. I'm sure that you're all going to stick with me. There's not a lot going on in America, according to what I've read. So I'm just going to make it nice and slow. The article that I published on that movie, which is kind of using that movie as an excuse to talk about something much deeper, a deeper political change that happened here. It's based on events that I saw myself. I moved to Israel in 1995 when I was 17, and what I understood to be going on at that time was a move toward progress or peace. There was a peace process that was very much a going concern. This was in the 90s, which I think we didn't appreciate enough at the time. The 90s were kind of a great decade in retrospect. I didn't really understand how great they were then, but I think many of us do now. And progress was kind of an assumption. It was just what was happening, right? Clinton was the president, and the Soviet Union had collapsed and had been replaced by democracies, or so it seemed, and peace in the Middle East and so forth. And that really changes in the year 2000. In 2000, the most left-wing government that Israelis had ever elected, which was the Ehud Barak government, the government that I voted for. I've always been affiliated with the left side of the Israeli spectrum. that government was on the receiving end of the worst wave of terrorism that we'd ever experienced. And the government had made an attempt to sign a peace deal, not just with the Palestinians, but with the Syrians as well. And my assumption was that this was kind of a foregone conclusion. Peace was just necessarily what was going to happen, which is what you could believe if you were born and raised in a place like Canada, where stability is just kind of the default option as far as you know. But in 2000, everything kind of collapsed. And instead of the outcome being peace, what we saw was cafes blowing up and buses blowing up and a wave of suicide bombing like nothing we'd ever seen. And this was triggered when a left-wing government was in power. And the assumption at the time was that if you create a vacuum on planet Earth, it will be filled by progress, by democracy, by stability. That was the 90s assumption, not just in Israel, by the way, but in general. You have a bad system of control, you remove that system of control, and in the vacuum, you're going to get something better. That was really 90s theology, and it's repeated in Iraq, and it's repeated in other parts of the world. And it turns out not to be true. You can remove a negative system of control and get something worse. And what happens is that Israel pulls out of territory in the West Bank, Israel pulls out of territory in South Lebanon, Israel ultimately pulls out of territory in the Gaza Strip, and the vacuum in those places isn't filled, as we hoped, by democracy and stability. It's filled by radical interpretations of religion. It's filled by violence that was worse than anything we'd seen before. And it was something that I experienced in my own life in a way similar to that movie, which is why the movie resonated for me. I was a college student in Jerusalem in those years from 2000 to 2003, the worst years of the terror bombings, and we just got used to living with an insane level of insecurity. I mean, restaurants would blow up. We would sit in restaurants. I would always make sure we'd still go out. You know, we went out to restaurants. We'd always make sure not to sit too close to the door. And on buses, there were all kinds of theories about where you should sit on the bus to increase your the likelihood of surviving a suicide bombing. And those years really changed the Israeli political psyche in ways that aren't always easy for outsiders to see. So if we look at the Knesset now, you'll see that the political left has basically died. The Labor Party, which used to run Israel, which founded Israel, and which was always the party that I voted for, the Labor Party functionally has ceased to exist in the last election. And the right, which means different things in Israel than it means in the United States, but the right's dark predictions about what dangers the Middle East held in store for Israel were unfortunately proven correct in the eyes of most Israeli voters, and that very much informs every aspect of our political existence right now. So outsiders still talk about left and right as if that exists here, but it doesn't exist here in the same way. Very few Israelis believe in the solutions that were on the table in the 90s. The tipping point, the point when that changed was those years of suicide bombings for which we don't even have a name. We don't even have a name for that period. Talking about the years between 2000 and 2003, 2004. It's a crucial kind of tipping point in Israeli history, and I think in world history as well, because it's the same years as 9/11, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. The world changes in those years and becomes, I think, a more pessimistic place, and we're living with some of the ramifications in 2020.
Thank you for sharing that history. And I think it's something that it's always helpful for us to be reminded of when we're thinking about events on the ground in Israel, and as you so rightly put it, even here at home. So kind of just moving past that a little bit, but still utilizing what you just said, you've argued for a while now that framing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the framing of that conflict, has really sort of created a perception gap, especially for us in the West. What do you mean by this perception gap? And can you give some more insight into, how you think we should be viewing the conflict?
Sure. I mean, there are a few issues on which there's a perception gap here. One, and we've discussed it, if you remember what we talked about in Israel. I'm sure you're all taking notes and review those notes every evening just to stay fresh. One part of the perception gap is just the idea that this is a very important country. People in the West, and particularly in the United States, think of this as a very important country. It's a center of world events, a center of conflict in the world, to some extent, when in fact it's actually a quite small country in which the conflict is very small in terms of number of fatalities. This is a country of about 9 million people. It's a New York-sized country. It's 1/5 of 1% of the landmass of the Arab world. So part of the gap is just thinking that it's very important when in fact it's quite small and peripheral. It's less important, I think, than many people think in terms of geopolitics, although it's very important to me personally as someone who who lives here, and I think it's fascinating and kind of a very rich place to explore. Another part is what you mentioned, which is the context in which the conflict here is presented. It's become accepted to present this conflict as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That is the news framing of the story. When I was a reporter for the AP for almost 6 years, between 2006 and 2011, and that was our story, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the thing is, there isn't a conflict that goes by that name, and there never has been. Israel's conflict has never been just with Palestinians. From the inception of the conflict, it's been a regional conflict. The 1948 war, for example, was fought by Israel against at least 5 Arab armies, depending on how you want to count. And to this day, Israel's enemies are regional, not just the Palestinians. The Palestinians are one small part of the Arab world. Of course, it's the part in closest physical proximity to Israel, but Israel's main enemy at the moment is the Iranians, who are not only not Palestinian, they're not Arab. They're Muslim, but they're not Arab, which means that there's a much bigger conflict going on here that can't be described as Israeli-Palestinian. If it's an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where are the Iranians in the conflict? Where are the Syrians? What about the Arab, the Arab world more generally? So if you call it the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what you end up doing is zooming in so tight that nothing in the conflict makes sense. Because if you think that Israel's enemies are just the Palestinians and that Israel and the Palestinians could resolve the conflict, then nothing about Israel's political behavior makes sense. When Israelis think about the conflict, we're zoomed out, see the whole Middle East, because most of our wars have not been against Palestinians, and half of the Jews in Israel come from elsewhere in the Islamic Middle East. That's an important detail about Israeli society, but people, half of the Jews in Israel have families that came from Baghdad, that came from Tehran, that came from places like Damascus and Aleppo. And when they think about their lives as Israelis, they're not thinking about Palestinians or only Palestinians. They see a regional story in which Jews are a part, a very small part, but a part. And I think a lot of that gets missed because of an oversimplification by reporters. And as reporters, we need to simplify. We need things to be easy to understand. A news story can really have 2 actors in it. Israelis, Palestinians, that's a 2-actor news story. That's digestible to a Western audience. Start talking about a news story that has 10 actors, 20 actors. It's just too complicated. People don't want to read it. And you end up dumbing down the story so much that the story becomes incomprehensible. And many reporters have become so accustomed to the framing of the story as Israel-Palestinian that they forget that that's not true. And that's actually, I think, maybe even more than an oversimplification. I think it's a fictionalization of the conflict, and it definitely makes it very hard to understand what Israelis are on about. If our enemies are the Palestinians, what are we so afraid of? Israel is much more powerful than the Palestinians. So what are we worried about? Well, the Palestinians are only one part of what we're worried about, one small part. And we're actually talking about a much bigger picture.
Thank you for that. And again, always such a helpful reminder of how to sort of view events in the Middle East. But, moving past the perception gap still sort of doesn't ignore the plight of the Palestinian people. So I guess, how do you separate these issues out? What are some useful ways to talk about the broader regional threats that you articulated, like Iran and its proxies, while still acknowledging the need for improved relations with Palestinians?
Yeah, absolutely. That doesn't contradict. And I think that's sometimes in the discourse outside of Israel, these things get mixed up. So if you talk about the Iranian threat, or the threat from the broader Islamic world, then that's interpreted as a right-wing position, when here it's not. That's a mainstream Israeli position. And being worried about what threats lurk in the Middle East, particularly from the direction of Iran, does not contradict concern for Palestinians, or a desire to have better relations, a desire to improve the lives of Palestinians, whether for altruistic motives or just for pure motives of self-interest. We live basically with the Palestinians. I live in a city, I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem. Jerusalem is 1/3 Palestinian, about, I guess, a 5-minute walk from the imaginary and invisible line between West and East Jerusalem. So, and of course, the work market in Jerusalem is completely mixed, and everyone is kind of interacting more or less all the time. So the happiness of Palestinians is directly connected to my own happiness, and many Israelis understand that and would like to see things improve. I think a better way to many people in the West imagine that the plight of the Palestinians is an Israeli decision. That is, if Israel were only to decide ABC, the plight of the Palestinians would improve. But that's not true. Israelis and Palestinians are 2 very small actors in a much bigger picture that they do not control. So Israel could withdraw from territory. For example, Israel could withdraw from the West Bank. That territory would not is not likely to become stable, safe, or democratic. And we can look at examples like Syria or Iraq, where we had a bad situation, an occupation run by Saddam Hussein in the case of Iraq, or by Bashar Assad in the case of Syria. Those occupations were removed or undermined, and the territories collapsed into terrible violence because the powers in the Middle East, the forces in the Middle East, are not working toward democracy and stability. So if you create a vacuum in this region, it doesn't become better, it becomes worse. And that's not something that Palestinians control, and it's not something Israelis control. So we're all kind of trapped in a region that's kind of disintegrating and spinning out of control. And it's not just an Israeli decision. I think we could do a lot better, which explains why I vote for who I vote for. I don't think we do a great job all the time, and I don't, I have a lot of criticism of our current leadership for thinking in a way that I think is unproductive. And in no way am I excusing us from all blame, but I think that even if Mahatma Gandhi ran Israel and Mahatma Gandhi's twin brother ran the Palestinian Authority, I don't think we would have a great situation here, because this is a very small corner of a region that's it's a pretty rough place, right? We're talking about a piece of land that's 1/5 of 1% of the landmass of the Arab world, 0.2%. So just like Belgium in the First World War doesn't control the fate of Europe, right? Belgium can have good leadership, it can have bad leadership, make good decisions, it can make bad decisions in 1915, but it doesn't matter that much if you're Belgium. There's a world war. You're not going to be able to affect it. The situation, unfortunately, is similar in the Middle East. So I think there's definitely room for critique of Israeli policy, and I make one fairly often, but people, I think, need to have reasonable expectations of what's possible in the Middle East in 2020 and the role of all the actors here in creating the current regional mess.
So one of the things you mentioned earlier was just the number of Israelis whose families or who themselves have come from other countries throughout the Middle East. And that kind of leads me to a question about your latest book, Spies of No Country, where you describe 4 members of the Arab section, which is, for our audience, sort of a secretive unit within the IDF that recruited Arab Jews who could essentially pass as Arabs. And they were sent to infiltrate places like Syria, Lebanon, as you described, Yemen, and this all took place before and after Israel's independence. And as a point of reference for our audience, they may be familiar with Eli Cohen, who was portrayed by Sacha Baron Cohen in Netflix's The Spy last year, where Cohen infiltrated some of the highest levels of Syria's defense establishment and frankly heroically provided intel that helped Israel during the Six-Day War. So with that context in mind, what can you tell us about these people and their role in Israel's history? And how can we, I guess, or how should we place their work in a political context? And what do their stories tell us about Israel today?
Thank you for mentioning the book. The book is a spy story. It's a story about 4 very young men who get caught up in kind of a wild adventure at the very moment of the birth of the state of Israel. In 1948, they're picked up by the intelligence services and turned into spies. There isn't really a spy school. It's all very ad hoc. Some of these kids are orphans, basically street kids living on the margins of Jewish society in Israel at that time. And they become useful to the national movement because they've come from the Arab world. And it's a story that says a lot about Israel, because I think people have an idea of Israel that's quite European. And the idea persists in the West, particularly among people who haven't been here. The story of Israel, as we still tell it, including many Jewish people, by the way, is a story about Europe, Herzl and pogroms in Eastern Europe and socialism, the kibbutz idea, and the Holocaust, of course, and that all looms very large, and David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir and the great heroes of Israeli history. But the truth is that half of the Jews in Israel come from the Islamic world, not 5% or 10%. Half of the Jewish people in Israel come from Morocco, Tunisia, Iran, Afghanistan, Kurdistan, and that very much shapes the country that we live in. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write that book was to address that. It's kind of a secret identity, I think, in many ways. Is the country presents itself as European, thinks of itself as European, it wants to be European, but isn't. And it's enough to come here, as I know that many of you have, and stand on a street in Israel and look at the people and try to figure out who's Jewish and who's Arab here. If you, interact with Israeli pop music at all, you'll notice that it doesn't sound like Western pop music. It's Middle Eastern. And our politics are pretty Middle Eastern, for better or worse. And the way Judaism is practiced here is not at all like Judaism is practiced in the United States, because it's informed very much by Jews who came here from the Islamic world who had a very different idea of Judaism and how it's practiced. And that, I think, ends up being the dominant force in Israeli society, not the European side. It's the Middle Eastern side, what we would call the Mizrahi. That's the word we use in Hebrew, which means Eastern. That's the side that really shapes what Israel has become. So we have this idea of a European country, and then you come here, and it's not that at all. And I know many Jewish people come to Israel expecting it to be a Jewish country, as Americans understand a Jewish country to be, and they look for the bagels, but there are no bagels here. People don't eat bagels, except Americans. People eat, Levantine food. They eat, couscous from North Africa and hummus and Middle Eastern food, which they think is Jewish food because that's the food of their ancestors who are from Damascus and from Baghdad and not from Warsaw and Vienna. And that's a very important part of society here. So I thought if I could tell that story about spies, about how these Jews from the Arab world find a place for themselves early on as people who can cross the lines and pretend to be Arab, that says something deep, not just about Israeli intelligence, it's the founding of Israeli intelligence, but it says something deep about the country and about, I think, the most important aspect of the country that isn't well enough understood by observers from the West.